Greetings, noble viewers, and welcome back to It's So Royal. Today we're embarking on an epic quest through the annals of history to unravel the glittering legacy of the medieval knight. Ever wondered how those gallant, armour-clad heroes of yesteryear evolved into the dashing, sword-wielding stars of today's blockbusters? Dust off your imaginary sword and join us as we journey from the muddy fields of medieval warfare to the dazzling, dramatic world of modern cinema. Prepare for a tale of myth, glamour, and the occasional dragon, because history has never looked this good. Once upon a time, when men wore tights and metal. The medieval knight, a beacon of chivalry, a bastion of bravery, and a walking contradiction wrapped in 60 pounds of steel. When you think of knights, images of shining armour, noble deeds, and noble steeds probably spring to mind. But if you peel back the layers of polished metal, you'll find a more complicated and, frankly, more amusing story. Imagine a world where men's fashion peaked with chainmail tights, where your social status depended on how many peasants you could tax, and where the line between hero and highwayman was as thin as the edge of a knight's sword. Knights didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were forged in a chaotic mix of military necessity, feudal economics, and good old-fashioned ambition. And, as with all things human, the story of the knight is as much about blunders and bluster as it is about valour and virtue. This narrative begins in the dark, muddy fields of early medieval Europe and ends in the bright, shiny halls of modern pop culture, where knights have been transformed into symbols of an era that never really existed. Chapter 1. The Birth of the Knight. The early days, from foot soldiers to fancy lads. Picture Europe around 800 AD, a time when roads were more like mud tracks, the average person bathed annually, whether they needed it or not, and the world was a patchwork of small kingdoms constantly at war with each other. Armies at this time were as organised as a toddler's playroom after a sugar binge. Soldiers were mostly local peasants drafted for a season or two, armed with whatever sharp implements they had on hand, pitchforks, scythes, maybe a rusty sword if they were lucky. In such a haphazard military environment, the concept of the knight as we know it didn't exist. But things were starting to change. As these small kingdoms grew, so did the need for a more reliable military force. Enter the mounted warrior, a game-changer in the chaotic world of medieval warfare. Early knights weren't exactly the chivalrous figures you might imagine. They were more like the medieval version of a thug with a horse. If you could afford a horse and some armour, you could charge into battle, run down the infantry, and loot to your heart's content. It was a simple formula: wealth plus horse equals power. These early knights were essentially just the richer members of the warrior class. Having a horse was a status symbol. Think of it as owning a sports car in a world where most people were lucky to have a donkey. But horses were expensive, and so was the armour that went with them. This meant that only the wealthiest could afford to become knights, turning knighthood into an exclusive club of well-armed aristocrats. This was the age of the chevalier, the French word for knight, which comes from cheval, meaning horse. Yes, being a knight was all about the horse. The chevalier wasn't just a soldier. He was a walking, or rather trotting, symbol of his lord's power and prestige. These mounted warriors soon became indispensable to their lords, and their importance would only grow as time went on. Feudalism, a pyramid scheme with horses. To really understand how knights came to dominate medieval society, we need to talk about feudalism, a system that can only be described as the medieval world's most elaborate pyramid scheme. At the top of the pyramid was the king, who, like any good pyramid scheme boss, owned everything. The king would grant large chunks of land to his most loyal supporters, the nobles, in exchange for their promise to provide military service when needed. These nobles, in turn, would parcel out smaller pieces of their land to their own vassals, usually in exchange for the same promise. And at the bottom of this feudal pyramid were the peasants, who actually worked the land and got nothing in return except the opportunity to be taxed, conscripted, and occasionally trampled by a knight's horse. In this system, knights were the enforcers, the muscle that kept everything running smoothly, or as smoothly as it could in the Middle Ages. The noble who owned the land needed knights to defend it from other nobles who were always on the lookout for more land. This is where the knight's role as a professional warrior came into play. Knights were not just soldiers, they were landowners themselves, given their own little fiefdoms to manage in exchange for their service. This is how the feudal system perpetuated itself. Land was power, and knights were the means to protect and expand that power. Feudalism was brilliant in its simplicity and ruthless in its execution. Everyone owed loyalty to someone above them, and everyone below them owed them loyalty in return. This web of obligations created a society where loyalty was the highest virtue and betrayal the greatest sin, unless, of course, betraying your liege lord could get you more land. In that case, it was just good business sense. The life of a knight, therefore, was a constant balancing act. They had to keep their vassals in line, manage their own lands, and be ready to answer the call to arms whenever their lord decided it was time to bash some heads. In return, they were granted lands, titles, and a place in the social hierarchy. And if they were really lucky, they might even get to marry a wealthy heiress and retire to a nice castle, far from the muddy battlefields and smelly peasants. Chapter 2. The Knightly Ideal. How to win friends and influence serfs. The Code of Chivalry, a handbook for the medieval hypocrite. By the time the 11th century rolled around, knights had become the rock stars of medieval society. They were the subject of songs, stories, and even the early forms of fan fiction, epic poems like The Song of Roland that depicted knights as the ultimate heroes. But with great power came great responsibility, or at least the appearance of it. Enter the Code of Chivalry. The Code of Chivalry was a set of rules that knights were supposed to live by. Rules that emphasized bravery, loyalty, honor, and a deep sense of duty to one's lord and the Christian faith. In theory, it was the moral compass for every knight, guiding him in all his actions. In reality, it was more like the medieval version of "do as I say, not as I do." Let's take a closer look at some of the core tenets of chivalry. Bravery. A knight was expected to be fearless in battle, charging headlong into danger without hesitation. Of course, this was easier said than done when the enemy had archers who could turn your shiny armor into a pincushion. Bravery was often more about appearances than actual courage. After all, no one wants to be the first to turn and run. Loyalty. Loyalty to one's lord was the cornerstone of chivalry. Knights were expected to serve their lords faithfully, even to the point of death. However, medieval history is littered with examples of knights who switched sides when it suited them. Loyalty, it seems, was conditional on who offered the best rewards. Honor. Honor was a slippery concept in the Middle Ages, often defined by what a knight could get away with. For example, ransoming a captured enemy knight was considered honorable, slaughtering unarmed peasants less so. But hey, honor is in the eye of the beholder, right? Defense of the Church. Knights were supposed to be the defenders of the Christian faith, fighting against infidels, heretics, and anyone else who didn't quite fit the medieval mold. This led to a lot of defensive actions, like burning villages and massacring non-believers during the Crusades. But as long as it was done in the name of God, it was all good. Protection of the weak. This was perhaps the most ironic of all chivalric ideals. Knights were supposed to protect those who couldn't protect themselves: women, children, the elderly. Yet knights were also the ones who most often terrorized these groups, especially during times of war. The reality of medieval life was harsh, and knights were as much a part of that brutality as anyone else. Despite these contradictions, the Code of Chivalry became a powerful tool for maintaining social order. It provided a framework for knights to justify their actions, however dubious those actions might be. And let's face it, when you're pillaging a village, it's nice to have a moral code that says you're doing it for the greater good. Knights and religion, holy armor Batman. If you were a knight in medieval Europe, your relationship with religion was both simple and complex. On the one hand, the church was your spiritual guide, promising you eternal salvation if you followed its teachings. On the other hand, the church was also a political power player, often manipulating knights to serve its own interests. It was a marriage of convenience. Knights needed the church's blessing, and the church needed knights to enforce its will. The most obvious example of this relationship is the Crusades, those epic holy wars where knights were called upon to reclaim the Holy Land from the infidels. The First Crusade was launched in 1095 by Pope Urban II, who promised knights that if they died in battle, their sins would be forgiven and they would go straight to heaven. This was like offering a free upgrade to first class in the afterlife, and knights flocked to the cause. The Crusades were a strange mix of religious fervour, military conquest, and economic opportunity. Knights who participated saw it as their sacred duty, but they were also well aware of the potential for land, wealth, and glory. The Holy Wars were less about saving souls and more about expanding influence and filling coffers. For the Church, the Crusades were a way to solidify its power, spread Christianity, and remind everyone who was really in charge. But the relationship between knights and the Church wasn't always smooth. Knights were notorious for their worldly behaviour, drinking, gambling, womanizing, all things the Church frowned upon. Yet, as long as a knight was willing to strap on his armour and fight for the faith, the Church was willing to overlook his less than pious lifestyle. After all, nobody's perfect, and who better to defend the faith than a man who really needed some redemption? Chapter 3. The day-to-day life of a knight. Spoiler. It's not all jousting. Training days, from squire to knight, or how to survive hazing. Becoming a knight wasn't as simple as buying a sword and a horse. It required years of training, discipline, and a high tolerance for being bossed around by your elders. The process began at a young age, typically around 7 or 8, when a boy from a noble family was sent to live in the household of another noble as a page. As a page, the young boy's duties were mostly menial, fetching, carrying, and generally being at everyone's beck and call. But this was all part of the plan. Pages learned the basics of courtly life, from table manners to the fine art of sucking up to the right people. They also began their physical training, learning to ride horses, handle weapons, and maybe even read a little, if they were lucky. Around the age of 14, if the page hadn't run away or been crushed under the weight of his own expectations, he was promoted to squire. A squire was essentially an apprentice knight, and his life revolved around serving his knightly master. This meant polishing armour, tending to horses, and standing around looking menacing while his knight did all the fun stuff, like jousting and battling. Squires also received more formal training in combat. They practiced with wooden swords, learned to use a lance, and were taught how to stay on a horse in the middle of a battlefield, a skill that was harder than it looked. Training was brutal, and injuries were common. But if a squire could survive the beatings, bruises, and constant humiliation, he might one day be knighted. The actual ceremony of knighthood was a big deal. It involved a lot of ritual, prayer, and usually a night of fasting and vigil. The squire would spend the night before his knighthood in a church, praying and meditating on the responsibilities he was about to take on. Or at least pretending to. More likely, he was just trying to stay awake and not think about how much his knees hurt. The next day, the squire would be dubbed a knight in a grand ceremony, usually involving a blow to the shoulder with a sword, a symbolic last blow he would receive without retaliation. From that moment on, he was a knight, expected to uphold the ideals of chivalry, defend the weak, and, most importantly, kick some serious medieval butt. Castles. Not as cosy as they look. When you think of a knight's home, you probably imagine a grand towering castle, a place of luxury and comfort, filled with roaring fires, sumptuous feasts, and tapestries galore. Reality, however, was a bit more drafty and damp. Castles were indeed the homes of knights, But they were also fortresses designed for defense, not comfort. The typical medieval castle was a cold stone structure with narrow windows to keep out arrows, thick walls to keep out invaders, and winding staircases to make sure everyone got lost at least once a day. Inside, castles were not much cozier. The main hall, where knights and their households would gather, was often smoky from the large central fire that provided warmth and light. Furniture was sparse, and what did exist was heavy and uncomfortable. The floors were usually covered in straw, which served as both a carpet and a handy place to drop your food scraps. Bedrooms were small and sparsely furnished, with little more than a bed, if you were lucky, and a chamber pot, because running water was still a few centuries away. Knights and their families would often sleep fully clothed, not just because it was cold, but because you never knew when someone might try to storm your castle in the middle of the night. Despite the lack of modern conveniences, castles were symbols of power and prestige. They were also centres of activity, where knights managed their lands, held court, and planned their next military campaign. When they weren't fighting, knights spent their days overseeing the work of their serfs, administering justice, which often involved a lot of arbitrary decisions, and preparing for the next feast, tournament, or skirmish. Chapter 4. Knights in Shining Armour. The Rise of the Tournament. The Tournament Circuit. Early medieval reality TV. If there was one thing knights loved more than fighting in actual wars, it was pretending to fight in front of a crowd. Tournaments became a major part of knightly culture, offering a chance to show off, win prizes, and maybe even catch the eye of a fair maiden, or at least someone with a large dowry. Tournaments were originally training exercises for knights, a way to keep their skills sharp in between wars. But as they grew in popularity, they became more about entertainment than military readiness. Knights would gather from all over to compete in various events, the most famous of which was the joust. In a joust, two knights would charge at each other on horseback, each aiming to knock the other off with a lance. It was a sport that combined the grace of ballet with the bone-crushing impact of a car crash. The goal was to unhorse your opponent, ideally without breaking too many of your own bones in the process. But jousting was just one part of the tournament. There were also melee battles, where groups of knights would fight in a mock battle, which often turned into a real one. Archery contests, sword fighting, and even wrestling were also common events. It was like the medieval version of the Olympics, only with more armour and fewer rules. Tournaments were as much about socialising as they were about fighting. They provided knights with a chance to network, build alliances, and, of course, show off their skills. For the spectators, tournaments were a rare opportunity to see knights in action, and they often turned into grand festivals with feasting, dancing, and general revelry. The prize. It's all about the bling. Winning a tournament was more than just a matter of pride. It was a lucrative business. The prizes for victory often included valuable horses, weapons, armour, and sometimes even cash. For some knights, especially those without much land of their own, the tournament circuit was a way to make a living. In addition to the official prizes, there were also the spoils of war, so to speak. Knights who won a joust could claim the armour and horse of their defeated opponent, which could be worth a small fortune. This led to a kind of arms race, where knights would spend enormous amounts of money on the best equipment in hopes of winning even more. But the financial rewards weren't the only attraction. Winning a tournament could also bring fame and prestige, which were valuable commodities in medieval society. A knight who made a name for himself on the tournament circuit could attract the attention of wealthy patrons, land grants from his lord, and marriage proposals from noble families looking to boost their status. Of course, tournaments weren't without their risks. Injuries were common, and deaths, while rare, did happen. But for many knights, the rewards far outweighed the risks. After all, what was a broken rib compared to the chance of becoming a legend in your own time? Less dangerous, unless you counted the risk of being trampled by your own horse. Knights on the battlefield. War is hell, but at least you get to wear cool armor. Ah, knights. Those gallant, gloriously armoured figures of medieval legend who pranced about in shiny metal suits, clanging their way across the battlefield with all the grace of a caffeinated giraffe. If you've ever wondered what it was like to be a knight in the Middle Ages, let me paint you a picture. Imagine being a walking, talking tin can with delusions of grandeur and a penchant for getting stuck in inconvenient places. But hey, at least you looked cool doing it. The armour. Because why settle for practicality when you can have style? First off, let's talk about the armour. The medieval knight's fashion statement was a masterpiece of design and engineering. Or at least that's what they told themselves while they tried to figure out how to use the bathroom in a full suit of plate armour. If you've ever seen a suit of medieval armour, you know it looks like something a steampunk enthusiast might design after a particularly heavy night of binge-watching fantasy films. Made from hundreds of overlapping metal plates, the armour was the medieval equivalent of a luxury car. You had your chainmail for flexibility, your plate armour for protection, and a plume on your helmet for, well, I'm not quite sure what the plume was for, but it certainly added a nice touch of unnecessary drama. The goal was to be the most intimidating, immovable object on the battlefield, and boy did they achieve it. The problem was, the knights didn't realise they had also become the most immovable object in the sense of, you can't get out of this mess without assistance. The helmet, a study in headwear dysfunction. Let's start with the helmet. Ah yes, the helmet, an engineering marvel designed to ensure that you couldn't see a darn thing, but at least you looked utterly heroic while squinting into the abyss. The classic knight's helmet, or great helm, had all the visibility of a phone booth and the ventilation of a sealed tuna can. On hot days you could roast your brain in there, while on cold days it provided a delightful frigid breeze to complement the goosebumps. In battle, this lack of visibility was less than ideal. Imagine trying to navigate a chaotic battlefield while wearing a metal bucket on your head. You'd be about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. But hey, you were a knight, and knights were too busy looking impressive to worry about minor inconveniences like being able to see or breathe properly. Mobility, or lack thereof. Now let's talk mobility. Ever seen a knight trying to dismount from a horse? It's like watching a transformer trying to squeeze into a smart car. The armour was designed to make knights nearly invincible to sword strikes, but it also made them about as nimble as a concrete block on roller skates. Getting off a horse required a complex ballet of awkward wriggling and grunting. And let's not even get started on the jousting. The joust was a sport designed to test your ability to remain upright while charging at a person who was also charging at you, both of you encased in heavy metal. It was a game of skill, strategy, and a healthy dose of whoever can survive this without spontaneously combusting gets to live another day. The battlefield. A symphony of chaos. The battlefield itself was a charming locale, much like a high-end supermarket, but with more bloodshed and less chance of finding a good deal on avocados. The knights, bless their hearts, were there to maintain order in a world that clearly had no use for it. Picture this: hundreds of heavily armoured men charging at each other while trying not to trip over their own feet, all while shouting in what can only be described as a cacophony of manly grunts and battle cries. The terrain was typically muddy, uneven, and covered in various types of medieval detritus. Imagine trying to wade through a quagmire while encased in armour that weighed more than an adult cow. Your goal was to look heroic and to avoid getting stuck in the muck, both of which were about as easy to achieve as winning a gold medal in the How to Be Unproductive Olympics. The chivalry code, because rules are important in a bloodbath. Knights were also bound by the chivalry code, a set of rules designed to ensure that, even while slaughtering your enemies, you were at least polite about it. It's like having a no shoes, no shirt, no service rule at a bloodbath. The code dictated that knights should uphold honour, bravery and courtesy, because nothing says I'm going to decimate you, quite like a good old-fashioned tip of the helmet. Of course, this chivalric code was somewhat flexible. While it might be important to be courteous, it was also quite permissible to be a bit of a backstabber if it meant winning. This led to a charming variety of knightly behaviour, ranging from gallant displays of swordsmanship to underhanded tactics that made modern reality TV look like a documentary on patience. The battle strategies. Because charging blindly is always a good idea. When it came to battle strategies, knights were about as organised as a toddler's birthday party. Most strategies involved the straightforward approach of charge at the enemy and hope for the best. There was a certain elegance to this strategy, primarily in that it was guaranteed to result in a large number of confused and disoriented knights staggering around the battlefield. The knights would line up in neat formations and then charge forward in a synchronized display of metallic chaos. The hope was that their sheer mass and shiny armor would intimidate the enemy into submission. Sometimes this worked, and sometimes it just resulted in a lot of clanging metal and a pile of bruised egos. But hey, if you were lucky, you'd emerge from the melee with both your honor and your life intact. If not, well, there was always a good chance you'd end up as a cautionary tale told by the local bard. The post-battle clean-up, an exercise in suffering. After the battle, knights would engage in the glamorous task of clean-up. Picture the scene, a field strewn with the remnants of combat and knights trying to remove their armor while nursing bruises and trying to remember which parts of their body still worked. The process was akin to peeling a particularly stubborn potato, but with more grunting and less chance of ending up with a tasty dinner. Removing the armor was an elaborate affair, involving assistants who helped pry off the metal plates and scrape off the mud and blood. The result was a rather unflattering picture of the knight, now stripped of his heroic garb, and looking more like an exhausted potato farmer than a gallant warrior. The legacy of the knights, the cool armor lives on. Despite the general misery and discomfort that came with being a knight, their legacy has lived on. We romanticize their valor, their codes of honor, and yes, their impressively shiny armor. Movies and books portray them as the epitome of cool, where they ride majestic steeds and engage in epic duels, all while looking like a walking armor advertisement. In reality, the life of a knight was a blend of high drama, excessive discomfort, and the constant threat of becoming a footnote in history. But at least they got to wear cool armor and live out their dreams of glory, at least until they had to face the harsh realities of medieval warfare, which involved a lot more mud, blood, and awkwardness than anyone in a Hollywood blockbuster would ever care to admit. So next time you're watching a film about knights, just remember, behind every heroic charge and every dramatic sword fight was a man in heavy, uncomfortable armor who was probably trying to figure out how to get out of a very messy situation. They might have looked cool, but the battlefield was less of a glamorous stage and more of an uncomfortable, chaotic mess where style did little to ease the suffering. In the grand scheme of things, it was a bit like being a superhero who had to fight crime in an inflatable suit. Impressive in theory, but a bit of a hassle in practice. The decline of the knight, when armor became a liability. Welcome, dear readers, to the world of medieval knights, a realm where shiny armor and chivalric codes once ruled supreme, but which eventually succumbed to the inexorable march of progress and common sense. Picture a group of bravely clad men in suits of armor so heavy they could bench press a car, galloping around on horses while attempting to wield swords that were practically as tall as they were. Ah, the glory days of knighthood. But as it turns out, even the most epic of armoured heroes were not immune to the advances of time, technology, and, let's face it, sheer absurdity. The golden age of armour. Shiny, heavy, and now with extra tripping hazards. The medieval period was, for all its warts and questionable hygiene practices, an era of great innovation, specifically in the field of making things as cumbersome as possible. The knight's armour, that shining symbol of medieval swagger, was the pinnacle of technological achievement. Also the knights thought as they lumbered around like human tankers. To understand why armor became such a liability, let's first bask in the glory of its design. We're talking about plate armor, the medieval equivalent of strapping on a small car to your body. It was a marvel of engineering, if by marvel you mean a convoluted mess of overlapping plates designed to be both impenetrable and impossibly difficult to move in. Each piece was meticulously crafted to ensure that, in addition to being practically impervious to swords, it would also serve as a personal sauna. On hot days, knights would roast in their own sweat. On cold days, they would freeze, provided they could actually move enough to notice the temperature. The dawn of firearms, or how to ruin a good party. Enter the early firearms, those pesky little inventions that took one look at a knight in his impenetrable armor and said, "Hold my beer." Gunpowder and early firearms were like the medieval version of a high-tech cheat code that rendered all that intricate metalwork as useful as a chocolate teapot. Initially, knights probably thought, guns, novel little contraptions. Surely they'll be no match for our heavily armored awesomeness. And so they galloped onto the battlefield with the same misplaced confidence as someone about to test an umbrella in a hurricane. But as the old adage goes, there's no armor strong enough to withstand a direct hit from a musket. Early firearms had a tendency to make knights reconsider their career choices. A musket ball would slam into a knight's armor, not necessarily penetrating it, but certainly knocking the wearer around like a pinball. Imagine being the bravest knight in the land, only to have your heroic charge abruptly halted by a tiny, leaden pellet that leaves you bruised and battered, questioning your life choices. Gunpowder and the art of unnecessary pain. Now, let's address the real kicker, gunpowder. The stuff that made medieval warfare a lot less about chivalric duels and a lot more about explosive firepower. The early guns might have been unreliable and slow to reload, but they had a magical ability to make knights rethink their life choices. Sure, armor could protect against slashing swords and blunt force trauma, but it was about as effective against a well-placed cannonball as a paper umbrella is against a hailstorm. And so, the once-feared knight found himself not only outmatched, but also painfully aware that all his shiny armor did was make him a particularly expensive and impractical target. The evolution of warfare. From chivalry to, why are we still using horses? As if the firearms weren't enough, warfare itself was evolving at a pace that made traditional knights look like they were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. The rise of infantry tactics and ranged weapons like longbows and crossbows began to show that maybe, just maybe, charging headlong into battle while clad in 2 tons of metal wasn't the most strategic approach. The longbow, in particular, became the medieval equivalent of the cheat code that made knights wish they had stuck to less dangerous hobbies. Longbows could shoot arrows with enough force to pierce armor, and perhaps more humiliatingly, they could do so from a distance. A knight could now be felled by someone he hadn't even seen, making the whole bravery in close combat thing seem a bit redundant. And then there was the humble crossbow, which was essentially a more user-friendly firearm for those who had no intention of learning how to actually use a bow. Crossbows were perfect for taking out heavily armored knights from afar and making sure that every heroic charge ended with a well-aimed bolt that said, "Thanks for coming. Now go home and try not to bleed all over the battlefield." The armorer's dilemma: how to make armor both useless and heavy. By the late Middle Ages, armor had become more of a hindrance than a help. The armorer's job was to find ways to keep armor both ineffective and as cumbersome as possible. They succeeded marvelously. Every new design was a testament to their dedication to making knights look like they had been wrapped in a metal cocoon, while simultaneously making them as agile as a snail on tranquilizers. Armorsmiths, driven by the desire to outdo their predecessors, continued to add elaborate decorations and intricate engravings to armor, ensuring that not only was the knight encumbered by a small mountain of metal, but he also had to pay extra for the privilege of looking like an oversized Christmas ornament. At some point, it became clear that while the armor might be impressive in its craftsmanship, it was entirely useless in a battlefield that increasingly resembled a free-for-all shootout. The fall of the knightly code when honor became a liability. Knights were also bound by their codes of honor, an admirable but ultimately impractical set of rules that dictated how they should behave on the battlefield. Unfortunately, honor and practicality rarely go hand in hand. As gunpowder became more prevalent and the tactical advantages of the knightly charge were overshadowed by the grim reality of warfare, the whole concept of chivalry started to look a bit out of touch. In theory, the knightly code was a beautiful thing. It encouraged bravery, courtesy, and fair play. In practice, it was about as useful as a parachute on a submarine. The very qualities that made knights ideal for one-on-one combat were increasingly useless in a world where winning required not just bravery, but also the ability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. Knights were expected to engage in honourable duels and treat prisoners with respect, which was a charming notion until faced with the realities of a battlefield where every man for himself was a far more practical approach. Honour became a quaint relic of a bygone era, overshadowed by the brutal efficiency of modern warfare. The knight's new role, from battlefield to parlour trick. As the medieval period drew to a close, knights found themselves in an increasingly awkward position. They were still around, but their traditional role had become more about looking impressive at tournaments and less about engaging in actual combat. Knights started to shift from battlefield warriors to ceremonial figures, and their once feared armor was repurposed as a sort of historical costume for special events. Tournaments, those grand displays of medieval chivalry, became the new battleground where knights could showcase their skills without the actual risk of death. These events were essentially medieval cosplay conventions where knights got to parade around in their cumbersome gear while pretending to engage in heroic combat. It was the medieval equivalent of LARPing, live-action role-playing, where the stakes were high on pageantry but low on actual bloodshed. The legacy of the knight. More irony than actual armor. In the end, the decline of the knightly class was not just a tale of armor becoming a liability, but also a story of how times change and how even the most majestic of roles must adapt or fade away. The once feared knights, who had once been the embodiment of martial prowess and chivalric virtue, found themselves becoming a nostalgic relic of history. Today, knights are remembered more for their flamboyant armor and their grandiose ideals than for their actual battlefield accomplishments. They have become a symbol of a bygone era, where grand gestures and shiny metal were enough to impress, but where the realities of war and technology ultimately rendered them obsolete. So next time you see a depiction of a knight, whether in a film or a historical reenactment, just remember, behind the clanging armor and the brave posturing was a complex reality of heavy metal, early firearms, and a rapidly changing world. Knights might have looked spectacular, but their decline was a lesson in how even the most impressive armor can become a liability when the world moves on and leaves you looking like a very expensive and rather impractical relic of the past. The legacy of the knight, from myth to Hollywood. Knights, those gallant armor-clad warriors who once roamed the medieval landscape with swords drawn and plumes fluttering, only to eventually find their way onto the big screen, where they've been given the Hollywood treatment, a far cry from the sweaty, mud-streaked reality of their historical counterparts. The legacy of the knight has undergone quite the transformation, shifting from the gritty, somewhat impractical reality of medieval warfare to the dazzling heroic fantasies of modern cinema. So grab your popcorn, put on your most elaborate chainmail, or at least a tinfoil hat, and let's embark on a journey from the battlefield to the blockbuster. Knights of the Round Table, the original superheroes. Let's start with the knights as they were once known, the medieval heroes who, if history were a comic book, would have been the original superheroes. They had everything going for them: courage, code of chivalry, and an impressive array of really heavy, shiny armor. Their stories were a tapestry of heroic deeds, romantic quests, and the occasional dragon slaying, all told in a language as flowery as their plumed helmets. In reality, knights were the guys who rode around in cumbersome suits of metal, trying not to trip over their own feet while battling on muddy fields. They were not exactly known for their practicality. The tales of their heroism were embroidered with a level of grandeur that was, let's be honest, somewhat embellished. The legend of King Arthur and his Round Table was essentially medieval fan fiction, highly entertaining, but not exactly an accurate depiction of knightly life. If Arthur and his crew were real, they'd have had to deal with medieval bureaucracy and some very awkward dinner parties. The legend lives on, how knights became historical celebrities. As the centuries rolled on, knights began to be viewed less as historical figures and more as larger-than-life celebrities, with their tales of valor and adventure turning into mythic legend. The medieval era's equivalent of TMZ was busy spreading the word about heroic deeds and chivalric romances, turning real-life struggles into epic sagas. The process of turning historical figures into legends is as old as storytelling itself. It's not much different from how modern celebrities are turned into icons, only with less social media and more exaggerated tales of heroism. The knight's valor and courtly love became the stuff of legends, spun into tales that involved damsels in distress, epic battles, and the occasional magical artifact. In reality, the knights were probably just as concerned about getting stuck in the mud and dealing with feudal lords as they were about rescuing damsels and slaying dragons. From pageantry to pop culture, how knights became movie stars. Fast forward to the 20th century, and knights started making their grand entrance onto the silver screen. Enter Hollywood, the land of make-believe, where the most mundane historical fact is transformed into a spectacular, high-octane adventure. This is where the myth of the knight truly took off, complete with heroic monologues, epic battles, and, of course, a generous dose of creative license. Hollywood's knights are the epitome of romanticized history. They're the chiseled heroes with impeccable aim, unbreakable armor, and a level of bravery that seems to be effortlessly matched by their charming good looks. These are the knights who can swing a sword with one hand while delivering a perfect one-liner with the other. Their armor gleams as if it's been polished by an entire army of overzealous cleaning staff, and their battles are choreographed to the point of looking like an elaborate dance routine. The knight in shining armor, how modern cinema nails the shiny part. Modern cinema has perfected the look of the knight, transforming him into the ultimate action hero. We have the medieval equivalent of the superhero costume, a suit of armor that's so well crafted it seems to defy the laws of physics. In movies, knights are rarely seen struggling to move, dismount from horses, or get stuck in their own armor. Instead, they perform gravity-defying feats with the kind of agility that would make an Olympic gymnast envious. Take, for instance, the classic depiction of a knight in a Hollywood epic. The armor is always pristine, the sword always sharp, and the horse always impeccably groomed. And while the knights in these films might be facing off against fearsome foes, they do so with an effortless ease that belies the grueling reality of medieval combat. It's a far cry from the reality of knights being essentially overgrown toddlers trying to play tag in a full suit of metal. The drama of damsels and dragons, why the Hollywood knight always gets the girl. No tale of a Hollywood knight would be complete without a side plot involving a damsel in distress and a fearsome dragon. These elements are practically mandatory in any film featuring a medieval hero. The damsel is often portrayed as a delicate flower in need of rescue, while the dragon is usually a large, fire-breathing creature that's more interested in causing mayhem than engaging in constructive dialogue. In reality, the damsels of the medieval world were probably far more resourceful and capable than their Hollywood counterparts. They were likely running households, managing estates, and dealing with their own set of challenges, none of which involved being rescued by a dashing knight. Similarly, dragons, while undoubtedly fearsome if they existed, were much more likely to be metaphorical rather than literal. Hollywood's dragons are impressive, but they're about as real as the knight's perfect hair. Knights and modern pop culture, from Lancelot to Knights of the Round Table. The fascination with knights has not been confined to the realms of film and television. Knights have also made their mark on literature, games, and even theme parks. The classic tales of Sir Lancelot and King Arthur have inspired countless adaptations, from swashbuckling adventures to satirical comedies. These stories have been reimagined in every conceivable format, from medieval romance to modern parody. In video games, knights are often portrayed as the ultimate heroes, slaying mythical beasts and embarking on epic quests. These digital knights, much like their Hollywood counterparts, are depicted as virtually invincible, capable of overcoming any obstacle with a combination of skill, luck, and a penchant for collecting shiny loot. The games, while entertaining, often reinforce the myth of the knight as a flawless hero, rather than the sweaty, exhausted warriors they likely were. Even in theme parks, knights are given the royal treatment. Medieval-themed attractions feature knights engaging in choreographed battles and jousting tournaments, all while maintaining a level of pageantry that's both impressive and slightly absurd. The experience is designed to make visitors feel like they've stepped into a historical epic, complete with all the glamour and none of the actual messiness. The real legacy of the knight, beyond the myth and movie magic. So, what is the real legacy of the knight once we strip away the Hollywood glitz and the romanticized tales? At its core, the knight represents an ideal of bravery, honor, and chivalry, a set of values that, while often idealized, were deeply ingrained in medieval society. The historical knight, for all their cumbersome armor and impractical tactics, was a product of their time, striving to live up to an ideal that was as much about societal expectations as it was about personal valor. The knight's legacy is also a reminder of how history is often filtered through the lens of myth and legend. Just as Hollywood transforms historical figures into larger-than-life heroes, our perception of the past is shaped by the stories we tell ourselves. The knights of today's media are not so much a reflection of historical reality as they are a representation of our enduring fascination with heroism and adventure. In the end, the legacy of the knight is as much about the stories we tell as it is about the historical figures themselves. Whether they are portrayed as chivalrous heroes on the battlefield or as swashbuckling adventurers in the movies, knights continue to capture our imagination and remind us of a time when valor was measured not just by victories in combat, but by the stories that would be told for centuries to come. So next time you watch a film about knights or read a tale of medieval heroism, just remember, while Hollywood may have polished the legend to a gleaming shine, the real legacy of the knight is as much about the tales of valor and the ideals of honor as it is about the clanging armor and the muddy reality of medieval life. And there you have it, brave souls. From the gritty, clanking reality of medieval knights to their polished, epic portrayals on the big screen, the legacy of these chivalrous heroes has certainly evolved. Whether they're galloping across the battlefield or dazzling us in a Hollywood blockbuster, knights remind us of a time when valor and honor were all the rage, though a bit less practical than one might hope. If you enjoyed this journey through history and cinema, don't forget to hit that like button with the force of a knight's lance and subscribe for more royal content right here on It's So Royal. Until next time, may your days be as grand as a medieval feast, and your adventures as thrilling as a knightly quest. Farewell, and may the legend of the knight continue to inspire.